All right, I think we're going to give it one more minute before we get going, just in case there's some last minute people joining. All right, well, I think we're going to get started. I just want to welcome everybody here. Thanks for attending. We're grateful that we're able to put this on, and with technology, we're able to do it at no cost to everybody, and hopefully we can share some good information with all of you. We're really thankful for the co-hosts of this event, and Justice for All, the CAP Association of Utah, Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, and Utahns Against Hunger. So we're really grateful for all of those associations, passing this along to you, their members, and then also associates inside the nonprofit space. We've hopefully got some great content put together for all of you that can help in different aspects of your organizations. As we go through this, feel free to ask or type out any questions in the Q&A part of the WebEx. And after all the presenters present, we'll have a few minutes for them to go through and answer any of those questions that you might have. So feel free to just ask it as the questions come to you, and we can go through and answer those. So just to get started, we're going to first hear from Clint Cottam over at the CAP of Utah Association. Clint has been the executive director for the association for about 4.5 years now, and he's been part of the community action program in the state of Utah for a little over 10 years now. So he is a wealth of knowledge, and we're really excited to hear from him and everything that he can bring to the table for us and our organization. So without further ado, we will go ahead and turn it over to Clint. So.
Thank you so much, Gavin. Um, as Gavin mentioned, I'm Clint Cottam. I'm Executive Director of Community Action Partnership of Utah, and I'm excited to just share some things today about grant management. Just a little bit about me. In addition to being Executive Director at our state association for Utah's 9 community action agencies, I'm also a nationally certified results-oriented management and accountability trainer. I have a Master's of Public Affairs from Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. I have experience in public and nonprofit sectors. I came from a public community action agency, one of our AOGs, prior to this, but I also have a background in criminal justice, social services, and regional planning, and I've managed lots of grants. And I'm going to give a caveat that some of the things I've learned have been through trial and error and things I've learned the hard way. And I continue to learn. Okay, so just a brief overview of what I would like to present on today. First, I'd like to talk a little bit why grant management matters. Also, I'd like to talk a lot about Peter Drucker, and I call this planning with Peter. He asks 5 essential questions. If you've never read this book, it's a very concise read. It's called The 5 Most Important Questions You'll Ever Ask About Your Organization. They even have some workbooks. Oops, I can't see that well with my virtual background, but they have some some self-assessment books that are really helpful as well. But I'll be talking a little bit about these 5 essential questions. We'll be talking about planning for outcomes and what to do before even applying for the grant. And then we'll be talking about evaluating performance, and then I'll tie it together with the logic model. And for those in our network, you're probably loving that. So first off, I want to ask why grant management matters. There's a quote I really like from Peter Drucker that says, "For years, most nonprofits felt that good intentions were by themselves enough." But today we know that because we don't have a bottom line like a for-profit business does, we have to manage better than a for-profit business. I want to emphasize that part. We have to manage better than a for-profit business. We have to have we have to have disciplined, rooted in our mission. We have to manage our limited resources of people and money for maximum effectiveness. And we have to think through very clearly what our results are for our organization. So in the for-profit world, we measure success by how much money you make. In the nonprofit sector and the public sector, we measure the changed lives and the changed communities. Also, I bet you if I were to see your faces and ask, how many of you really enjoyed paying your taxes this year? I bet you probably not very many people would be super eager to raise your hand. We also have to be considerate that a lot of our nonprofits do receive federal grants, whether we get them directly from a federal funder or through a pass-through via state or local government or another partner. No one really likes paying taxes, and I think as taxpayers, you deserve the ability to excuse me, I think I might have just a second. I need to hurry and change something on my screen. Okay, sorry about that. So we have an accountability to the taxpayers whose money we're spending. And good management is also required by law. There's a couple things I want to illustrate. And for those who have participated in our introduction to Roma training or performance management in our network, you may have heard of these before, but the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993 and then the GRPRA Modernization Act of 2010. Both of these really talk about transparency, making sure that federal funding is results oriented, that they have a target and show how closely you met those targets and what the success is. It also, in 2010, really talked about the need for coordination across multiple agencies. So as we've gone and progressed over time, the accountability has increased. And again, this is a way to protect taxpayers' investment in people and communities. I want to, try to break up some of this content with a clip from The Office. I think this will illustrate why it's important to know about good grant management.
Rule 17. Don't turn your back on bears, men you have wronged, or the dominant turkey during mating season. There are 40 rules all shrewd boys must learn before the age of 5. Learn your rules. You better learn your rules. If you don't, you'll be eaten in your sleep.
Okay. So if you don't know your grant management really well, you don't want to end up being somebody that gets eaten in your sleep. And so I guess I want to take a time to look through this pyramid real quick about how do you actually know about your grant requirements? Like what actually governs it? Well, one thing is, first off, if you're going to apply for a federal grant, you probably should come back to the authorizing legislation. Sometimes you'll have funders and pass-through requirements and a whole bunch of things that come up and add to it. But essentially, you need to come back to what does the law that authorizes that spending require. And just as a general principle, law will trump regulations. After regulations, or after authorizing law, we talk about federal regulations. I want to put a real big emphasis on 2 CFR 200, which is the uniform guidance. Generally, there are some common things you can and can't do with federal funding. Knowing about those regulations from the uniform guidance will help avoid a lot of costly mistakes. But also take with a grain of salt that you can follow the uniform guidance, but if your authorizing legislation has something different, again, legislation will trump regulation. Also be mindful that your federal funder could have additional or supplemental regulations that govern how your spending and performance are handled. Also, go back to your notice of funding availability. It's a wealth of knowledge, and I think we forget about that. It will cite the important regulations and laws that are governing the funding source. And if there's anything special in this pot of money, that will show up in your notice of funding availability, or your no, And then finally, most of us will get. I would say most nonprofits will at least at some point get federal funds passed through a pass-through entity. That could be your state partner. That could be a local government, a city, county. That could even be through another coalition or nonprofit. In the uniform guidance, there are abilities for pass-through entities to put additional requirements. If you are working with the state, for example, state of Utah, you also have to consider what kind of effect state laws and regulations of your state agency could do for your grant performance. As long as it's in line and builds off of the authorizing legislation, your federal regulation, it is appropriate. So know what your local pass-through funders need and require. And then finally, look at your contract. Your contract should be the ultimate kind of combining of all of these. Make sure that your contract is something you look over and review frequently. Because if you want to talk about getting eaten in your sleep, I think ignoring that top part is kind of a risky game to play. Also be mindful that some federal grant requirements have specific performance management frameworks. I'm showing an example from our community service block grant world that kind of governs our community action network. They actually require the results-oriented management accountability platform or a comparable platform to be used. And the one that's in the CSBG Act really builds off of Peter Drucker. And this is just a brief kind of overview of the performance management cycle that CSBG grantees are required to know and implement and really follow. Okay, I'm going to turn over a little bit now to Peter Drucker and really talk about his 5 questions. And from his book, he said the most important aspect of the self-assessment tool is the questions it poses. Answers are important. You need answers because you need action. But the most important thing is to ask these questions. So here's the 5 questions that Peter Drucker gives in this lovely book. It's a great read. It's worth an investment in. But these 5 questions are: what is our mission? Who is our customer? What does the customer value? What are our results? And what are our plans? I think it's important to be able to answer these even before you apply for federal funding. But even after you receive the grant, it's good to keep coming back to these questions, making sure that we have alignment and that, again, we're not going to get eaten in our sleep by some kind of something we missed in our grant management. When you are applying and planning to apply for a federal grant, I just like what Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. What are the changes that your federal partner or your pass-through entity want to see? That's why I think looking at the notice of funding availability or NOFAs are important. Through these, your funder is communicating what the expectations, what the purpose of it is. And again, look at the legislation. Why did Congress even authorize funding for this program in the first place? I would caution, make sure that you're outcome oriented. Too many providers start with the service and intervention, particularly to keep maintaining something they're already doing. But we don't really plan for outcomes, and we don't give ourselves the room to look at if any changes are needed or if we can improve, right? So start looking in what do you want the changes to be? And then just remember that GIPRA, as we showed in that taxpayer slide, talks about being outcomes oriented, right? So also with needs, just a quick talk about needs and outcomes. Do we have a well-defined needs statement? Do you really know and have a good handle of what the needs are? And to really be able to ask, whose need is this that you're trying to meet? Is it a community-wide need? Something that was more of a community initiative, something that would if you solve that issue or filled that need, would move the needle on like a poverty rate or a literacy rate or some kind of other rate? Is it an individual or family need? Is it something that you would do through a program to help people? Or sometimes you have federal funding sources that actually offer capacity building, which allows you to look at your agency's need to better serve families and communities and build a stronger, healthier need agency. Being able to know your needs will help, because as far as I know, I've not seen a grant application for federal funds that has not asked at one point or another to document why your services and why your program or your project is even needed. Also think about outcomes. Outcomes are generally the opposite of a need. And just as a quick example, so if I had identified a family level need, something that I would accomplish through a program, I could say families need housing they can afford. The outcome that I would be trying to look for is that families obtain housing they can afford. All right, so just to know, when you want to track what an outcome is, it's a change. And so on a family level, these changes would be an increase in knowledge, skills, or ability, or a change in attitude or behavior, or a change in status. Sometimes also prevention can be preventing a negative movement can also be an important outcome. On the community level, you want to look at changes in public policy, improve conditions like a social, economic, or environmental condition, or increase access to services and resources. That's where a lot of infrastructure and community-wide resource planning comes into play. And then finally, agency, your increase in resources or capacity, that you're better trained, better funded, you're better able to serve your family and communities, like we mentioned. And just remember, the things you do, the services you render to people, or strategies you implement in a community, these are outputs. These are not itself what you're trying to plan for, right? These support your outcomes. And so when you do things for a family or in a community, these outputs ultimately create outcomes, and your outcomes are the things that have an impact. So if you were to, just as a quick example, I'll go through just for the interest of time, but like in this case, what is the outcome? Well, first we have a family level need of individuals need transportation to get to work. The outcome is the opposite of the need. Individuals acquire transportation. On an agency level, staff lack skills to work with families in trauma. The opposite, the outcome that we're shooting for, is that staff with have skills to work with families in trauma. And then finally, on a community level, there's not enough affordable housing, and I would say units in our community. And the outcome we're shooting for is the community increases its affordable housing units. So these are some really basic things just to keep in mind in your planning stages. Also, before you apply, Peter Drucker gives a really cautionary tale, one that I think aligns well with mission drift. He cautions, never subordinate the mission in order to get money. If there are opportunities that threaten the integrity of the organization, you must say no. Otherwise, you sell your soul. Where the cat's scary demon in the shadow in the background. But that's really important, that the mission, it is really important to make sure that you don't just chase federal funds. And I think all of us can probably find instances where we have, and probably some instances where we did sell our souls a couple of times. And it doesn't usually work out for the best for us. And if you're one of the exceptions, I wanna hear it, because I generally have not found a good time where I've sold my soul chasing a grant. So some things to consider too when you're writing and planning for a grant. Plan across the organization. It's not just a grant writer and management's job to write for and manage a federal grant. Peter Drucker comes back and says, the plan begins with the mission. It ends with action steps and a budget. Action steps establish accountability for objectives. Who will do what by when? And the budget commits the resources necessary to implement the plan. To build understanding and ownership for the plan, action steps are developed by the people who will carry them out. Everyone with a role should have an opportunity to give input. This looks incredibly slow, but when the plan is completed, the next day everyone understands it. In our results-oriented management accountability training, there's actually a graphic we share that says, hey, great, we got the grant. Now what? You don't want to be that place. You don't want to be somebody on the front line who has no idea that your grant writer even committed you to certain things, right? I bet you frontline workers on here have had instances where that's happened. Make sure you have good buy-in and know what everyone's role in the agency is before you write for the grant. Also, be really intentional about the connections. Like we said before, outputs, the services lead to outcomes which have an impact. It should be really clear to a funder and to everyone in your staff and your boards. You begin with the needs, you know what type of inputs. Why are you even going after this federal funding? What other resources are you leveraging for inputs? What services then do you offer to get those outcomes? It should be really clear and well connected. And just like Peter Drucker mentions, we should be really cognizant of the needs of our customer. And I want to, if I could look at your faces and have some, if I could see your reactions, I would probably ask for a raise of hands. How many, whose needs are more important? Is it more important to meet the immediate needs of a customer, particularly one in crisis? Are your needs of your frontline staff the most important? Or are the needs of your funder? It could be your federal funder, it could be a pass-through at the state or county. Which one would matter? Well, the answer is all of the needs matter. And sometimes I've heard in my experience managing grants and managing programs, the paperwork sucks. The data entry stinks. I don't have to do this because I didn't become a case manager to do paperwork or to do data entry in a system. You have to look at all of the needs, and unfortunately that won't fly with some of your federal funders. Peter Drucker talks about the question, who is my client? Yeah, you definitely need to have your primary customers, so your client that it will take part in your program, the whole reason you're in business, right? Their needs are important. But you also have to make sure that you look at your staff and funders as secondary customers. And as customers, they also have needs that need to be identified and met. So it's about trying to bring balance to the force in this, about making sure that you're service oriented for the people who need you the most, but not jeopardizing your secondary customers. So some mistakes I think I've personally made and have also seen over my years and have learned from others. So here's some grant writer mistakes that I have seen. Sometimes I see a grant writer that submits a grant proposal without a knowledge of frontline capacity, an understanding of the real community needs. Sometimes their needs are not well defined, and it's kind of hazy because we're trying to get something under the deadline to get some money. Is that internal, external buy-in from finance, HR, board members. Your board needs to be part of this process. They're ultimately the guardians of your mission and your organization. Also, sometimes you need to get some buy-in from other funders, particularly if you're trying to use other resources for leveraging. You probably should have some conversations. Also, a mistake is you write for a grant without the partnerships in place to execute. I have an example from somebody that I look up to that had decades of grant management experience. There were times where they wrote for a grant and actually didn't get it, but because they had the partnerships in place, when the next funding opportunity came up, they were able to accomplish everything because of their natural partnerships and the work they were doing organically in their community. But then there's also times where the same person talked to me about times where they just took the money and didn't have partnership. The implementation was a nightmare. It was hard to get the program off and going, and it was really painful. So just kind of also examine your partnerships and your organization's place it gets in your community. And sometimes it's probably better for a partner to write for a federal fund than you, but yet you can still play an active role even if you're not the one receiving the money. Also, another mistake is not communicating with staff and board what the expectations and requirements are. Going back to learning those rules to not be eating or sleep, know the NOFA, the Notice of Funding Availability, because that will tell you, and again, refer to all the regulations and laws that your funder is expecting you to comply with. Make sure that's communicated across your agency. As far as financial management, here's some of the mistakes I've seen, sometimes experienced. Not following uniform guidance. That's a really big one. And also, even bigger than that, sometimes we do a really good job following uniform guidance. What is generally allowable for federal funds as far as expenditures. But sometimes we're not aware of legislative or other federal regulations and laws that may exempt or change a uniform guidance regulation. I'm thinking specifically about some of these grants that put an administrative limit of like 5%. Sure, go ahead and have your de minimis or whatever, but ultimately at the end of the day, no matter what your negotiated indirect cost rate or the de minimis says, if your legislation gives you an administrative cap, legislation will trump uniform guidance. Also, make sure you have strong controls. Know what the processes are. Make sure that everyone who's going to be implementing this knows what their financial controls and your processes are. Make sure, make sure that your funding, your input is actually aligned to programmatic work. It should be really clear for a funder how we got to your funding contract and the money that they gave you to the services you provided and the changes you made. Do not treat federal funding as slush funds. This also includes there are some funding, I'm specifically thinking about what we work with in the Community Action Network about Community Service Block Grant. It's flexible funding, it's not a specific program, it's really needs driven and can change with each needs assessment. However, just because it's flexible does not mean it's a slush fund. It's got to be intentional, coming back to your community action plans and needs assessments. And even when you do find these flexible funds federally, you need to show a math. And some of these are done specifically to leverage and even sometimes support other programs. What I'm copying from somebody that I really admire from our national association is she talks about it as a delicious soup. If you're using federal funds to leverage and to build capacity and to make things better, you might have a delicious soup where you might have one grant be like the noodles and another one would be the broth. And you obviously have to have a bowl. You can make the components and ingredients come together, but a delicious soup is different from maybe a smoothie where I don't know how it was made and it was just blended up with a whole bunch of things. And I have no idea if there's anchovies or kale in there. So when we are trying to leverage funds that are even flexible, even in fiscal management, make sure that your funder can see a delicious soup and not a smoothie. Also, make sure that all grant eligibility has been followed before submitting a claim for reimbursement. Also, make sure that if you run into problems, communicate with your board quickly. And also, if you do have to make a change, maybe you ran out of one specific grant and had to move funding around, make sure that's communicated. Because again, if you were to change the funding source for a service, you could ultimately impact how you're reporting on your outputs and your outcomes for a funder. Finally, some of the things I've learned from frontline worker mistakes is when you're not aware of the grant terms and conditions and requirements. That's a big one. And you're not adequately aware of or following your policies and procedures that, maybe your grant writer even mentioned in your application. You're not accurately documenting your services based on actual time. So, for example, if I'm providing case management, something that's less of a direct financial assistance, I'm using just filling out numbers and time on my timesheet rather than using actual time to inform my timesheet, which then can actually impact my financial and my performance goals. So make sure that whatever you do in your grant, make sure you're documenting your actual time billed directly to and benefiting that grant. Also, not reporting the number of outputs and outcomes. Again, kind of coming back to why I didn't become a case manager to do paperwork. Sorry, this is a sad reality, but you might have to get your paperwork and your data in. And then finally, operating without any connection to finance. So make sure as we ensure accountability and work with our boards, make sure that we have financial, operational, and legal accountability. And again, those contracts are legal documents, I'm going to say too. And they're based on actual laws. So just some food for thought. Okay, make sure as you're implementing your grant that you are constantly collecting data, the right type of data, and you're analyzing. Is the process of data collection clear for those who are going to collect it? This is something that should be answered while you're writing the grant and not after. Who's responsible for data quality, making sure it's great? I will say I've seen agencies who review at least monthly their data. They tend to have more accurate data overall because they can find the issues that arise early, and they're not scrambling at the end of a grant cycle when the reporting is due because they've self-corrected and self-analyzed their data throughout the duration of the grant. Also, is your data analyzed by your board and management? That's a big thing. Your boards are the guardian of your mission. They should know what your data and your performance and financials included look like. Is current program data useful for writing for future grant opportunities? That's an important thing. You may want to think about not everything we want to accomplish can be done in 1 year. What data do we need to collect to go back to your funder for additional opportunities? Finally, can you prove that your outcomes or the changes you see and your outputs and services actually happened? What if a funder came out on a monitoring visit and called you out on it? How can you prove and show that you actually did what you said you did? Just some things to think about. Finally, think of data quality. I got this from some of the authors who do our results-oriented management accountability training. But just make sure that your data is complete, that there's no missing data information, that it's accurate, that they're timely. This is a big one, timely. For those who may be working in the homeless system, you may notice that there's even some HUD performance standards and some requirements from the state homeless office and HUD about when your data is actually put into your HMI system. That is done very intentionally. Data needs to be collected on time on a regular basis and be enough to be timely. That anytime a funder or your board or your management asks you a question, we can pull up the data and have an answer. And finally, it has to be reliable. It has to be meaningful to the specific topic. So some of this comes into planning. We should know what our processes are before we even apply. But look at during the performance of your grant, you should be looking at your data. Peter Drucker basically says this is not always the most comforting thing in a nonprofit world when we're trying our darndest to make good things happen. But he says surely we must admit that human efforts, no matter how well intended, must fall short, and that the refusal to admit failure and share the knowledge with others only compounds that failure. I cannot ever give you one example where any one of my original grant proposals went 100% the way I thought. Because people are not static. Like, people change. And I think my next slide will probably talk about that too, but things change. I can remember some really great plans I made at the end of 2019. There's this thing called COVID that just derailed everything. And it almost just make sure that if you find that you're not doing what you said you did, that you can analyze it early on in your grant, find where you're having shortfalls and where changes are needed, either in process, even sometimes programmatic changes. But if you fail to admit where things are falling short, it's only going to make the problem worse, especially the longer you go. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. And then Again, customers are never static. So if you need a change, one of the best things I've learned is to communicate with your funder early, because your funders care. They have a mission and they have accountability themselves for what they are passing money through to you. And if you let them know early, I found that many funders actually are willing to help me and support me in modifying a contract, getting technical assistance, or obtaining extensions. And it takes a really long time to modify contract scope of works. For those who may work with state and federal processes, these are not things that just get done in a snap right? There's a lot of processes and controls. So communicate early when you know that you're going to need to make some changes. There are some examples of what happens when you don't. I'm pulling this from our community action legal service that supports our network. They gave an instance back in January 2011 where a Head Start agency did not seek prior approval before building a Head Start center. And so ultimately, this caused their Head Start agency to pay back $1.8 million, all because they didn't communicate with their funder early. So we want to avoid these type of mistakes. Also, a more recent one came from December 2022. Sometimes your agencies may even act as pass-throughs for others. In one instance, the Department of Health and Human Services found an area agency on aging, a AAA, out of compliance because of not monitoring their pass-through and subgrantees. And some of the other things that came out of this were the fact that they were just time allocating all their costs based on budgets and not actual activity. You want to say, don't do that. Make sure there's big uniform guidance, but they also didn't really follow up on identified deficiencies, some of the shortcomings that happened in their agencies. And so they didn't go back to the subrecipients. And so it came back on them and they had to pay back. When push comes to shove, things always roll downhill. So make sure you protect yourself. But yeah, make sure if there are corrective actions, make sure you handle them early and build trust. And I think one other thing I just want to mention, I know we're kind of getting to the end, but when you do need a contract change or when something's not going right, absolutely get all approvals in writing. No verbal commitments or handshakes. Sometimes I've had the best funders and they have been amazing and they've been great partners and they've helped me when I've had issues. I communicated early, but I know some kind of change or some kind of accommodation was needed. I got really great buy-in from the funder from communicating early, but then that person left and the next person came along who was not as nice. Just saying, make sure to protect your agency and your organization. Get things in writing. It protects your organization. No matter how nice somebody is, it protects everybody. And then make sure that changes are recorded. It could be that succession planning isn't about your funder. What if you leave the organization? What if there's a change? Does your board and your management and all the people know about any of the approved changes from a funder? Right, we have to know our rules. If the rules change, are those being communicated and can people find them if you were to leave? All right, just in closing, just a couple things too. Just keep something like a strategic dashboard. Know your targets, what your financial and your performance targets. Make sure you know what's going on in your contract. And like I said, look early. Strategic dashboards are a really great tool to help inform your management and your board and your agency about where things are actually at. Also check for communications from your funders. So there were a lot of examples that came out of the pandemic. For instance, there's so many others I could talk about, but HUD had a ton of waivers that impacted things like Emergency Solutions Grant and Continuum of Care grants. Some of them impacted how we did home inspections, how we procured personal protective equipment, and even adjusted program AMI eligibility, which is kind of a big deal. Make sure you regularly check up on your funders. In this case, it was HUD Exchange, and participating in webinars from your funder. because your funders will tell you when something changes. You just have to kind of make sure that you're in putting yourself in a place to be part of the communication. Finally, think about long-term impacts. When, as you're evaluating your grant, maybe it's not, you find out that it's not the best fit. Maybe you find that, oh, with some tweaking, we could do even better. Or maybe you rocked out of the park. Really keep in mind how successful you are for the future. And then also, I want to encourage everyone to be able to use a logic model. This is what kind of brings things together. I'm going to show you an example that's specifically done for Community Action Network, and there are different versions of a logic model, but really, this is more than just something that maybe a federal grant will ask about, right? It needs to be something that's a living document that can help manage the performance and accountability of your organization in administering a federal grant. It easily connects needs to outcomes. It identifies intentional targets, not, wow, we accidentally helped somebody. Cool for us. It helps establish accountability, knowing who has what role, and it can be used to communicate across the agency with funders and with the public. And your board, I should probably put that in. Here's an example of a logic model that we use and teach about in our Community Action Network. We start always with the mission. The mission is the bedrock, making sure that we're not drifting from what our board has given us the directive to do. We start then looking at our identified need and problem, one that's identified in a community needs assessment or some other type of assessment. We start with the outcome, which is the opposite of the need. We've clearly identified how many units of what service to whom in what time frame. We're very specific about the number of people we're going to serve in a program. Then we tie it together and then say, out of how many people who receive services, these are the number of people we expect to achieve an outcome. And then we can come back later and then measure our actual performance against what we targeted. And then finally, we also have these 3 columns about accountability. What output measurements are the services? How do we measure when we do a service? And then how do we measure when a change happens? Who does it? What is the process? And where is the data stored? And then finally, how often is data collected, analyzed, and reported? What's the role in your board, your frontline staff, your financial people? And so this can be a great way to bring your whole organization. And I would even dare say, if you're a program manager, your grant funder would probably love a well-developed plan like this to help with grant applications as well. Anyway, I think those are just some of the things I wanted to talk about today, but I wanted to express my appreciation for letting me ramble and even share my Dwight Schrute video. Again, I work with our state association, Community Action Partnership of Utah. We support the 9 community action agencies, but we're happy to invite you to any of our other trainings and to be a resource if you have any follow-up questions. And with that, Gavin, I think I'm open to any questions.
Lawrence, are there any questions?
Yes, Clint. Actually, we currently do not have any questions in the Q&A queue.
So
Okay.
I see one, I think, that came from Terry. So thanks so much for this valuable information. Does Community Action offer classes for a deeper dive in approaching federal grants? We do actually offer a deeper dive. It does center around the Peter Drucker, like the results-oriented management and accountability. And it is a deeper dive, and it is applicable. The answer is yes, we do have some opportunities, and we'd love to invite you to participate. We do have public events posted on our website, which is caputah.org. And again, we welcome our other partners. We're not just like we value our other partners because we know as a community action network, we can't do this just by ourselves. We need our other nonprofit and human service providers to be partners with us, and we want to be a partner with you. And then,
And Clint, one thing we have from Jess Bryant, they said that this is a great overview. No questions. Just want to say thank you for the presentation.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Jess.
And another one just came in from Julie Rosier. Says, thank you, Clint. This was a great presentation. Thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you all. I know it's a little bit of a ramble, and I appreciate you letting me go through this. I will say I love doing in-person trainings where I can see your faces and have interaction. But I again just want to express my appreciation for letting me go through this presentation today. And will the slides be available for us? Yes. So Sharon, I believe that the slides are already up on the registration page for this event. Um, but if it's okay in the chat, I will try to put in a second my email address. If you're finding any difficulty accessing the slides, I'm happy to just email them to people as well. Okay, if that's everything, then I am going to say thank you all, and I'm going to turn the time over to Gavin for Mutual of America.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Clint. That was great information. Glad to hear it. Glad to have you here. Um, let me. Perfect. So a lot of you might not know who Mutual of America is or what Mutual of America is. So again, just a brief introduction. My name is Gavin Plaisir. I'm based in Salt Lake City. Mutual of America is a retirement company. We got our start a little over 75 years ago from United Way, back when it was still called the Community Chest. And we started as a nonprofit for nonprofit retirement accounts. Nonprofits were and continue to be in a neglected market. And so Mutual of America's really target audience in helping with retirement plans are nonprofits. So that's why we, have set this up and worked with these other organizations, worked with many of you on this call uh, to help you out because we know you need it. You're doing a lot of good work around the community, and you need as much support and help as you can get. So we're happy to be here and happy to be a part of the nonprofit space in Utah. So uh, today I'm going to be going over what we can do to help retain and obtain top quality employees. I have some connections over at Mountain America Credit Union, and I was able to sit down with the director of benefits in HR. And it was interesting because they have, I mean, a ton of people in HR. They had two people just handling benefits in HR. They have somebody that's handling the administrative leave. So it was just, interesting to see how such a large organization handles, just even something that a lot of you have your own. You're the CEO, the CFO, and the HR director. So it was just interesting to see that. But able to sit down with her. She has been the director of benefits for over 15 years now, and asked her a bunch of questions, got some great information, and I asked her if she would be willing to present to all of you today. And her words were, "I would rather die." She respectfully declined and let me know that she was. Or that she is terrified of public speaking. So she said she's happy to answer any questions, but she is definitely not going to speak to a crowd of people. So um, she shared with me some of the things that she would do if she were to leave her organization, if she were to go to any other organization, regardless of the size. So she said the first thing that she would do is she would get to know the employees. And she said the best way to do this that she has found over her 15 years of handling benefits is through conducting employee surveys. She says she does it at least annually, but she can do it as often as semi-annually. If she's covering in these surveys is she's going over current benefits that are currently being offered to the employees, and also going over benefits that the employer might be willing to offer. So, for instance, when I say might be willing to offer, she said we don't ask questions about benefits we know we're not going to offer. So, for instance, they have hundreds of branches, and she said we know that we're never going to offer daycare for our employees. It would just be a logistic nightmare, and we wouldn't be able to do it. So, in all of our surveys, we never ask about daycare. When asking about benefits that they currently have, she shared an example how a few years ago they asked about their health insurance plan. And they have currently a very good health insurance plan, and they previously had an even better health insurance plan. And they have 3,000 employees, and the average age of those employees is 24. And so when they conducted the survey and they were asking questions about the health insurance, they found that no one was using it, or at least not using it to the amount that they were paying for. And so they're like, wow, we could save a whole bunch of money if we just lowered the benefits in our health insurance, and we could put that money into different benefits. And so they were able to do that. And an example that she shared is in 2022, they asked, about adoption reimbursement program. And they said that they were surprised to find out that 80% of their employees wanted an adoption reimbursement. And so January of this year, they implemented that. And now if you work at Mountain America Credit Union, you go through the adoption process, they will give you a percentage of that cost. Back in a form of reimbursement. But the health and the healthcare benefits aren't going to be what they were a few years ago. And again, it was because they needed to know their employees. They thought that they were doing something great, and they were, but the employees didn't care. And so making sure that the employees care about the benefits that you're offering, it not only make sure that you're spending money in an appropriate way that will matter to your employees, but it also helps your employees feel like they matter and that their voice is being heard. And that does require implementing some of the things that you ask about. You can't just have the surveys and then not do anything with the surveys. Changes will need to be made with the surveys. But that's something that you need to talk about with the management team and maybe the board of directors before doing these surveys, and making sure that the things that you're asking about, maybe like a gym membership reimbursement, is something that the organization could actually afford to do. The other thing that she talked about was how there have been nationwide surveys conducted, and over 70% of employees have said that they would prefer more flexibility in the workplace over a higher pay or increase in pay. And so she said part of those surveys as well is asking your employees, hey, what kind of flexibility do you need in your work? And she shared how, they have multiple, I mean, hundreds of branch locations across the state, and they have to have somebody in there. Just like many of your organizations, you have to have people at the front desk, taking those emergencies as they come in, putting out those fires as they come in. You have to have people there. But she said that, we found that some of our employees needed a little bit of leeway. So they generally have two shifts. They have a morning and an afternoon shift. And what they found was that some of the employees needed to be able to start an hour or two later. Instead of starting at 7 or 8, they needed to come in at 9 or 10. And then they would leave a little bit after that first morning shift would. Or in the afternoon, they would come in a little bit earlier than the normal afternoon shift would start, and they'd leave a little earlier. So figuring out a way that you could logistically handle that. I know that a lot of the organizations don't have as much manpower. You don't have 3,000 employees to move around. You might only have 4 or 5 or 6. And so you just do have to work and figure out logistically how it could happen. But asking and seeing if your employees would want that, and then figuring out a way to make it happen is huge. I mean, it's a way to increase that employee retention without having to increase the money going out, without having to increase expenses. Clint mentioned in his presentation about case managers and how there's a lot of admin work that goes on behind the scenes. And that's true. And those case managers are on a daily basis putting out new fires. Many of you are handling and working with your customers, with people coming in off the street that have emergencies, that have crises going on. And you have to handle the administrative side of that as well, or else the funding will dry up and the organization will cease to be there. So the administrative work is essential. And maybe you need to look at, can we have our case manager work from home, maybe just one day a week, so that instead of being in the office and setting time aside on Friday afternoon to try and get their admin work done, and then having a family come in that needs assistance, and they can't turn them away, maybe giving them a chance to work from home. So that way there's no new fires, there's no new emergencies. Again, logistically, you have to figure out if it's a possibility for your organization, but it could be huge, especially if you have case managers or even yourselves feel like, man, I can't get my head above water. I am constantly drowning. I have new things coming in every day, multiple times a day, and I can't get ahead of my paperwork that I have to do, that the organization has to have. And so asking your employees, seeing if that's something they'd want. For me personally, I don't have an office space at home and I have two little boys. And so working from home, I actually get a lot less done. So I have to come to the office. I don't need to work from home because if I try and work from home, not as much work gets done. And then also moving to a shorter work week. There's some of you on this call that have already shared that they've moved to a 4-day work week and that they were able to actually get some really top talent that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to get. The top talent shared when they got hired that they're taking a significant pay cut to come and work for their organization, but the reason they're doing it is because they have more flexibility in their schedule, that they only have to work 4 days and they get that 3-day weekend. So when you're conducting these surveys, you need to ask questions again that your organization's actually able to accommodate to, but also looking at how you can be more flexible. And maybe you're the one that needs the flexibility and being able to work from home. And maybe it's not a full day, maybe it's just a half a day saying, hey, Tuesday, I'm not coming in until 2 p.m. on Tuesdays because all Tuesday morning I'm doing administrative work. So there's different things that you can do, and flexibility is one of the biggest things that is currently out there that you can do to help retain and obtain employees. So switching gears just a little bit, we're going to be talking about the Secure 2.0 Act. This is recent retirement legislation that was passed at the end of 2022, part of a massive government funding bill. And the theme of Secure 2.0 is helping people prepare for retirement, helping people get self-reliant in their retirement and not depending so much on Social Security. So for a lot of there have been a massive amount of new provisions and regulations that have come out with this. A lot of it we still need more clarification on from the IRS and the DOL on how it will look. And a lot of these provisions will not take effect until a few years down the road. Some of these provisions are available now, but not necessarily required for you to act upon right now. If you currently have a retirement plan, hopefully whoever your retirement provider has already reached out to you and let you know about some of these changes. If you don't have a plan, there are some provisions that will make it more affordable and more administratively feasible to have a plan. And if there are any questions about plan specifics, you can definitely reach out to me and I am more than happy to go over any questions that you might have to help you make sure that your plan is still in compliance or that it will be in compliance. Um, so one of the new things for people that don't have plans currently is they have a tax credit for plans that are starting up. So currently now, if you were to start a plan, they will cover 100% of the administrative costs up to $5,000. So if you've been thinking or talking with your board and saying, well, a plan is just a little too expensive right now, well, now they've made it to where virtually there's no administrative cost for a new startup plan. You can also use some of these startup credits as part of a multiple employer plan or a MEP. So they have tried to take these steps to encourage people to start a plan. For specifically for nonprofits, they have expanded 403Bs to be able to participate in a pooled employer plan. You might be familiar with pooled employer plans. They were mainly started for health insurance back in the day. You could get multiple organizations together. So instead of having 20 employees that you're trying to buy health insurance for, you have 200 employees. And just those economies of scale make it a little bit more affordable. So with retirement plans, you could have a 401k in a pooled employer plan. And now with the passing of the Secure 2.0, now 403Bs can participate in a pooled employer plan. So 403Bs have different benefits as opposed to 401ks. So it's nice for nonprofits to be able to help participate in those as well. Then also with qualified charitable distributions, individuals that are at that stage in life where the IRS is making them take out their RMDs or required minimum distributions can now give those required minimum distributions directly to a charitable organization to avoid some of the recognition of income. For those of you that aren't familiar with RMDs, it used to be 70 and a half. It's changed now, but 70 and a half, the IRS would make you start taking out money from your retirement plan, even if you didn't need it, because they wanted the taxable income. And so now your donors can contribute directly to your foundation, and they can avoid those income taxes that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So a great opportunity if you know that you have individuals that are in that age range that might not need the money. A great way for you to help raise money, and a great way for them to avoid some taxes that they shouldn't be paying if they don't need that money. So there's also been some changes regarding catch-up contributions. Now, we know in the nonprofit organization, you obviously get a wide spectrum of people of all ages that come in, but it does feel like the two biggest age groups that are coming in are those that are a little bit younger, maybe fresh out of college. And then we've also been seeing a big shift where there's a lot of people that are coming out of retirement and going back to work. With this crazy inflation that we've been experiencing, there's a lot of people that thought they could retire and have now realized they can't. And so, uh, we've heard from many of you that there's older people that are leaving retirement to come back to the workforce. And so, for those people that are trying to just get a little bit more prep for retirement, this is fantastic information that you should know for your employees. At age 50, last year, if you were 50 years or older, you could contribute an additional $6,500 to your retirement account. Last year, the cutoff was for somebody under age 50, they could put in 20,500. But for those people that are really trying to stockpile for retirement, the catch-up contribution is fantastic. And they have added an additional bracket from age 60 to 63. You can do an additional 10,000 or 150% of the catch-up contribution amount. So that's just a way to adjust it for inflation. And as you can see, that band, it'll be effective in the year 2025. So they have raised the catch-up contribution for those age 50 and over for this year, and then that extra band will come into place in 2025. And then, as I talked about RMDs previously, you can see here now that instead of age 70 and a half, they've pushed it back for this year. It'll be age 73, and then at age 75, 2023 will be when you would be required to start taking those distributions. And then they've also reduced the fees on those required minimum distributions. Again, there's people out there that don't need to take their money out and they'd like to keep it in their retirement account to let it keep growing. And they have lowered the fees. It used to be if you owed $100 for ease of numbers in your RMD and you didn't take it, the IRS would take 50%. And now they've lowered that to where they would only take 25%. So obviously best to still just take the RMDs and pay the taxes, but they have lowered those fees or penalties if you don't take them. And then switching to focus a little bit more on the younger people, possibly, they have made some new rules and incentives around helping people start wanting to save for retirement. So when somebody graduates from college and they've got all their student loans, they have added a provision which allows people with student loans to pay down their student loans and still get recognition as if they were putting that money towards their retirement plan. So an example, if you as an organization are doing 100% match for your employees' contributions into the retirement plan, and you have an employee that is not contributing to the retirement plan, but they are paying down their student loans, and let's say they're putting $100 a month towards their student loans, well, then you can still have the opportunity to match that $100 that they're paying towards their student loans into the retirement plan. So it's just a way for them to still pay down their student loans and still see some growth in their retirement plan. You're also able to now start providing small incentives. The DOL and IRS have not put a number on what a small incentive is. So, we don't know exactly what that dollar amount is, but giving gift cards or a little boost to help try and increase participation is now allowed. Also, for plans or for organizations that might be listening that don't have a plan currently, if you down the road decide you'd like to start one, and that's after January 1st of 2025, you will be required to include automatic enrollment and automatic escalation features in your plan. So if you don't want those features in your plan, if you know that, hey, we're not going to want to have those, then you need to start a plan before January 1st of 2025. If you have a plan and you don't have those features, you may want to consider adding those features. Just because that's the way it looks like legislation is going. They want plans to have these features in there because it just encourages people to save for retirement. It's very similar to when Utah changed their organ donor question on the driver's license. You know, it used to be, would you like to be an organ donor? Check yes, or, you know, leave blank for no. And then they switched it to say, hey, you are an organ donor unless you check no, I don't want to participate. And they saw the amount of organ donors increase dramatically. So it's the similar concept where, hey, if there's no action required, that's generally the path that people are going to take. So if it doesn't take any extra work to get enrolled in the plan, that's generally what people are going to do. A few extra provisions are they're increasing the contribution limits for simple IRA plans. Um, and then they're also going to require retirement plans to cover part-time employees. So if you have a part-time employee that's worked at least 500 hours throughout 2 consecutive years, they're going to have to be eligible for that plan. So there are a lot more provisions and stipulations, regulations that have been passed with Secure 2.0, but we didn't want to spend an hour or two going over everything. And then again, we don't have all of the information from the DOL and the IRS. We still need information, for instance, like the student loan repayment counting towards retirement plans. We don't know exactly what that will look like. Is the school going to give a receipt to the employer? Does the employee need to fill out a form saying that that's what they've done? You know, we just don't have all the information on how some of these regulations will be implemented, and so we're still waiting for further information there. Are there any questions? The slides here, if you'd like, the QR code will take you to a link for these slides, so you can go to LinkedIn and you can just download the slides now. I do know that this whole seminar, educational seminar with Clint, myself, and Jill's presentations will be recorded, or it is being recorded, and I believe we're looking at possibly emailing out the recording to all of you as well. So if you feel like you just missed something, that's totally fine. You can get it here, but if there are questions, more than happy to try and help answer any of those questions.
Hey, Gavin, currently we don't have any questions in the queue.
Okay, well, perfect. So now we're going to turn the time over to Jill Bennett of the Utah Nonprofit Association. She has been there for a little over 6 years now, and she has been the CEO for the UNA for just about a year now. So we're really looking forward to hear what she has to say. She's done a fantastic job of growing UNA across the state, and also just helping all nonprofit organizations with collaborating with each other, and really trying to help them achieve their missions and their goals. So we'll look forward to hearing from Jill now. And then after her comments, we are going to wrap things up. So Jill, you are free to take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that absolutely lovely introduction. I am so happy to speak with you today. One of the themes that I hope will emerge after my presentation is that for Utah nonprofits, we are better together. And I'd like to share a little bit about what that means and how we can make that happen. First of all, UNA, who are we and what do we do? We are the advocate for Utah's 11,000 nonprofits, and we advocate for these organizations on both the state and federal level. And we've been working nationally toward the above the line charitable deduction. The way the tax law is written right now, only about 12% of individuals who file taxes are able to claim a charitable deduction. And we saw that that was one of the impacts of donor behavior in the last several years. And we're working toward returning that status to our taxpayers. So that's one of the things we do. We also equip organizations with the skills and resources that they need to do their work better. So we have training on fundraising and development. We have training on outcomes and evaluations. We have a whole slew of training programs that are dedicated and determined and implemented with your needs in mind. And if there's something you need that we don't have, let us know and we'll figure it out. We also have do research for our organizations. One of the things that Clint had mentioned was knowing your mission. Our mission is your mission. We're here to make your life better and your work that much easier. So that's UNA. I don't know if we have, if the chat's available. I'd just like everybody maybe to put it in the chat who you are and what you do. And we'll come back to that later. Okay, he said it's on the same page as the QR code. Wonderful. So today what I want to talk about is I want to talk a little bit about the Utah legislative session in 2023, touch on the landscape of Utah's nonprofit, and speak to nonprofit commonality, talk about how money talks, follow the money, and look at the most viewed legislation and decide what's next for UNA and nonprofits. And I am going to get us out of here by 11. That's one thing I'm happy to commit to. So first of all, the 2023 Utah General Session, it was they introduced the most bills ever. I did some research on it and I couldn't find in the last 17 years that they had introduced more than 929 bills. Of those 929 bills, 575 bills were passed and 125 of them mentioned nonprofits. That mention might not mean that it impacted your work, but it was enough to get it included in a search that I did. Of those 575 bills, one of those was SB 223, the charitable, sorry, my brain just froze. The SB 223 created a fund for taxpayers to contribute to on their refunds. So if you're a Utah taxpayer and you want to contribute some of your refund to the charitable capacity fund, you can do that. And that fund will be administered by one of the departments in the state of Utah, and organizations that support your work will be able to apply for grants for that. So that's one of the bills that was passed, impacted UNA and some of the organizations here, but there were so many other bills that that the legislature went through, and some of them helped us and some of them made our work more challenging. So my first question, and you can put this also in the chat, is what percentage of the bills passed impact the missions of nonprofits? I said that there were 575. So of that 575, do you think that's 20%, 50%, whatever that number is, add it to the chat and we'll revisit that later. And then the second question I have for you today is, on average, how much floor time House and Senate is spent debating bills? So if the House spent an average of an hour per bill, and the Senate spent an average of an hour per bill, then you'd put that was 2 hours because they each spent an hour. And then what I want to talk about is a little bit is the landscape of Utah's nonprofits and what that looks like on a macro level. So for Utah, there are 11,000 nonprofit organizations registered in Utah. We as a sector employ 6.7% of Utah's workforce, and that's about 72,000 people. Nationally, nonprofits contribute $1.5 trillion to the US economy quarterly. The other thing we saw, and I'm sure you experienced it, was a 19% decrease in volunteers from 2019 to 2021, all while trying to cope with an increased need for services and shifts in donor behavior. Any one of the decrease in volunteers, the increase in the need for your services, and the shifts in donor behavior could send you reeling. Just one of those things, but the three of these have combined to create a perfect storm that challenges nonprofits, and it makes us, UNA, think differently about the work that we do, as I'm sure it's made you think differently about what you've been working on. So let's look at nonprofits by the heart. Every county in Utah has 5 or more nonprofit organizations, and our missions help people from birth to death and everything that happens in between. We have organizations that help people whose infants need human breast milk, and that breast milk must be pasteurized, and there's a whole slew of safety and legal ramifications for these organizations. But they provide, and there are mothers who donate it. If you've ever nursed a baby, you know what a true gift that is. And then we have an organization here in Salt Lake that helps people who would otherwise end their lives on the street die in a shelter with people who care about them beside them and give them dignity. And everything else in between, every joy, every trauma, every challenge we see, there's probably a nonprofit that can help us step in. And if you can think of a nonprofit or a need that hasn't been met by a nonprofit, let me know, because I'll add that to my presentation. The other challenge we have is that 89% of these 11,000 nonprofits serve communities with budgets less than $500,000. That means that our overhead, by comparison, can look very large. It means that we're probably working really hard to secure funders. It means that everyone is probably wearing more than one hat at those organizations. And what that means is that increases turnover, as Gavin talked about. It means that people leave their jobs are living with less secure futures. And we just find it highly ironic that the people who give so much to the community potentially have to give up some of the equity and some of the opportunities that people who work for-profit organizations. And those are the issues that UNA is working to mitigate and working on your behalf to change in the legislature and our advocacy plan for 2023 and 2024. And I'll share more about that as it gets approved by our board. So one of the questions I have for you is, if you want to do a quick game of the 5 degrees of Kevin Bacon, the nonprofit version. And what does this mean? This is my question for you is, if you look at the people in the room or another nonprofit, I know there are people who help individuals who need to recover from trauma. We have a number of organizations here that help people with food security, that help people with poverty. And just take a second and figure out from your organization to somebody else in the room how many steps it takes for your missions to entwine. I'll give you a few seconds to think about that, and then I'll jump into the answer, because I said I was going to get us out of here by 11. So if you imagine that there's a nonprofit like yours or like someone else on the call who helps people who are living unsheltered lives, what does that mean? How did those lives become unsheltered? One thing, if you roll back a step, maybe they lost their job. Maybe they lost their job because they were ill. Maybe they were ill because the air quality in their neighborhood exacerbated a condition that they already had. And maybe there's a nonprofit that's working to clean air. So if you think about that, that's just one thread of the many threads that connect our work. And some of us are closer, right? If you're working with people who are who are recovering from domestic violence, perhaps they had to give up their home and their job in order to leave a violent environment. There are nonprofits there that help them, and there are opportunities for all of us to collaborate with one another so that we can make our communities stronger. Now, bonus round, what movie is this still from? That's Kevin Bacon. He's 19 years old, and that's him in Animal House. So we're going from The Office to Animal House. So I did say that all of our missions are connected. That 5 degrees of separation, it's probably less, and it's depending on where we are. The other thing we see is there are organizations across our state that have the same mission and might not know it, or might not have the opportunity to connect. So perhaps you're a small museum in Grand County. There might be a museum in Brigham City that you all might be able to collaborate on or share resources or figure things out together. And that's where UNA comes in. We are here to help you find and make those connections. We recently launched an executive director coffee and conversation, and we launched it because we find that our work can be siloed. Sometimes there's things that just aren't good to talk through with your staff, and you need the conversation and the support from someone who knows what you're going through. So we launched our first one of those for 2023 earlier this month. And when we talked to everybody about what they hoped to get out of the call, they said they want friends who can help them. And when we heard that, we said, okay, we all need friends who can help them. And then we established some parallel coffees and conversations for people in development, for people doing volunteer management. And if there's a need for more, we will do that. But it's a chance for us to get together and talk about our missions and network. We find that when we have our receptions, which you are all welcome to attend, we find people who otherwise wouldn't connect and can find ways to collaborate. In December, we held nonprofit tabling at Patagonia in Salt Lake City, and two organizations that you wouldn't necessarily think could work together did. One organization was working on trees. Another organization had an outdoor preschool. They figured out a way that they could combine their efforts and have a gala or an event. I don't know if they got it done because it was just a few weeks ago, but those are those opportunities that only happen with connection. And I worry that the pandemic and our need to isolate threw a curveball in how those networking, how those ad hoc interactions were happening, because that's where creativity comes from. So we are diligently working to create more opportunities for you to find people that you can work with, so that you can accomplish your mission. The other thing that we know is that we are all subject to the same macro forces: the national and global economy, the national and world pollution, the federal, state, and municipal legislation. So let me talk for a moment about world pollution. Pollution in China impacts the snowmelt, or the snowpack here in Utah. The snowpack here in Utah influences tourism, which influences jobs. It influences the watershed, which influences our health. And we might think that that's just absolutely beyond our control. And as individuals, it certainly is. We can't go to China and tell them to clean up their air. For the national and global economy, we saw today that the Fed was talking about raising interest rates, which changes the impact that it has on lenders, which means that perhaps fewer people will be able to buy homes in an already in a housing market that's already higher than it's ever been. So those are the things that we know impact you. And some of these impacts are just absolutely directly, and some of these happen a little bit downwind. But the important thing to remember is that they do happen. And we're all also subject to federal, state, and municipal legislation. And we have to follow the law, but we also have the capacity to work together. And that's some other things that I want to talk about. So my first question: how much floor time, House and Senate, is spent debating bills? And the median enacted bill, so these are the bills that became law, receives 10 to 15 minutes of total floor consideration. And that's added across both chambers. So for each chamber, 4 to 9 minutes of debate. So these legislations and these rules and these laws that so deeply impact us and our missions receive as much, or on average, 4 to 9 minutes in either chamber. Now, I'm not saying that they don't do their due diligence behind the scenes, But I am saying that the time for public debate is relatively small. So what's influencing that? One of the things that when I looked into this, that I found that sadly I wasn't surprised is how money is distributed to legislators' campaigns in Utah. And this data is a little old. It's from 2018, but it was the most current data I can have. I found I saw some indication that that total that was 3.5 million in 2018 is now more like 6.5 million, but I couldn't verify that in time for this presentation. So if you look at this, you'll see that Utahns living in a lawmaker's district provided 6% of that funding. So that means that whatever district I'm in, I might have donated money to my state representative, perhaps my senator, perhaps my representative, and that comprised 6% of the funding on average that legislator received. We saw that Utahns living outside a lawmaker's district donated 8%. And politicians themselves were 3.6%. So those were self-funded or family-funded campaigns. But what really grabbed my attention, and I think it should give you pause too, is that special or out-of-state interests funded 82.4% of legislative campaigns. So that means that the needs of the people who live in those districts are not getting the same, are not funding those elected officials at the same level. Now, I'm not saying that all legislators will change their behavior based on receiving funding. And I'm not saying that we need to give more because or nonprofits A cannot contribute to a legislator's campaign, and B, we have other work that we need to do. And if we're personally torn between donating to a legislator's campaign or donating to a boots on the ground nonprofit, I think many of us would choose to use our money by donating to a cause. So at the end of the 2023 general session, the budget they approved a budget of $29.4 billion. And you can see on this slide where that money went. The vast majority of it are social services, and that's great. Some of it went to higher education, a little bit to capital facilities, transportation. You can see how the money shook out. Of that 29.4 billion, 14.6 billion was from state funds, and then 170 million was from the Federal American Rescue Plan Act. And I imagine the rest of it was federal grants. So when we look at it at the high level, it feels okay to me. Okay, education, social services, law enforcement, all that makes sense to me. Those are things that when Clint asked if we felt good about paying our taxes, we might not feel good about paying our taxes, but we know that it's important for our communities to be well funded so that we can teach our kids, that we can care for people who have needs greater than our own, or even our needs, depending on what they are. And that we have transportation that businesses and people can get around to do the work of running their lives. So when I look back at the bills that impact the mission of nonprofits, the quick and dirty answer is all of them. And that's because of the way everything is integrated and everything is connected with fewer and fewer degrees of separation. So that if school doesn't get funded to the extent that it needs to be, that means there are children who are going to have less opportunities later in life. With fewer opportunities later in life, that will impact their ability to earn income. The ability to earn income means that they will have fewer dollars available to support their families. Fewer dollars to support your family creates generational poverty. None of this is new to you. I know you all understand it, but I think it's important where we land is to understand what we can do about it. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more on that in just a moment. So we saw some wins in housing. We saw 97 million for a low-income housing tax. We saw 10 million for the Utah Housing Preservation Fund, 7 million for a crisis shelter and transitional housing in Box Elder County, attainable grants. Looks like big dollars. Probably not enough to solve our, no, not probably, not enough to solve our housing needs, but the legislature paid attention and did fund money in that direction. We saw similar wins in social services. We saw money going to hospitals. We saw money going to domestic violence victim services. We saw more money for shelters. We saw aid for postpartum Medicaid people, women who were suffering from postpartum concerns. We saw money for caregivers. We saw money going to mental health resources for first responders. And we saw $1 million for mental health services specifically earmarked for LGBTQ youth. Not everybody won. And that's what we saw that the legislators and I believe Senator Vickers made a point of saying that not everybody got what they want, but hopefully everybody got some of what they wanted. I suspect most of us didn't get everything what we wanted. So let me cherry pick a little bit and look at if we dive a little bit deeper into those numbers, what we saw. We saw, I've got a typo there, apologies. We saw the Native American Repatriation Fund have a one-time reduction of $10,000. We saw the Refugee Community Engagement through Soccer receive a donation of $100,000. We saw $140 million going to the Department of Alcohol and Beverage Services, warehouse and store construction, $9.3 million going to a Falcon Hill project, and the Fort Douglas real property transfer up at the University of Utah for $10 million. You might have your opinions about those. I certainly have mine, but we didn't see $140 million going to helping people living their lives as well as they could. So the most viewed Utah bills, and I got this from a website called legiscan.com, and you can look these bills up at your own time. The bill that attracted the most attention was Transgender Medical Treatments and Procedures Amendments, which outlines what doctors and therapists can do for transgender youth. Firearms regulations, I believe that legislation said that Utah didn't have to follow federal rules. And then there were some amendments created for wildlife. These are the things that caught the attention of our community. And if they caught the attention of our community, most of these impacted a nonprofit. And you can just see where they are and look at them. And I'm sure that you have your own way of checking bills, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about another option that you might have, because these are just absolute rabbit warrens. You can go down a bill and before you know it, 3 days have passed and you're groggy because you haven't slept and you haven't eaten, but you've spent a lot of time on the utah.le website. So these were the bills that attracted attention from the public. And my thesis is that there is something that we can do about this. So that's Bluto and a still from Animal House. Who knew that I would have an Animal House theme today? And he asked the question, was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? And we all know the answer to that. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's really funny and it's really inappropriate. So what do we do? What do we do with a state legislator and a federal legislature that might be ignoring some of our needs? So I find that this is what I think we ought to do. The first thing is advocating for your mission. Do not be afraid to lobby. Do not be afraid to advocate. We have training for you. We can help you do it legally and ethically. Advocacy means that you are speaking on behalf of your mission. Lobbying means you are trying to change legislation. There's an overlap there, and we can help you make sure that you stay within all the legal guidelines regarding that. Now is the time to start your advocacy plan. Look at what wins and losses you might have had in the legislature and figure out what you need. And that advocacy plan should include finding partners, building alliances, engaging your staff, board, friends, volunteers, and neighbors. You can post your issues on the UNA Advocacy Bulletin Board. And from there, you can support the positions of other nonprofits. Now is the time to make friends with elected officials. Invite them to your events. Attend any meetings that they have open. Introduce yourself, be polite, make them a friend. You may have entirely different politics and you may be completely in alignment, but the goal is to treat them with respect and figure out a commonality. Chances are you can find something that you both agree upon. Maybe it's the Utes, I don't know. But it's important to create that relationship because there is an adage that says friends do favors for friends. So you don't have the money to make friends probably by donating to their campaign, but there's an opportunity for you to create a relationship with them. All of their websites are on the utah.le website, all of their email. You can even text them. So all that information is available for you. But what's really important is that you start now because the work done for all those bills starts the year before. So if there's something you want to happen in the 2024 general session for Utah, you need to start that now. You need to decide what it is. You need to decide who your ally is. You need to start creating your one-pagers. You need to get everything rolling. But probably one of the most important things that I think you need to do is once you have that identified, is to figure out who your partners are. Who are your partners in the nonprofit community who can help you? Who are the nonprofits in your community that can share your concerns? So one of the great things about Clint's organization is he's created that community. For so many other nonprofits, it's a little bit harder. You might be really small. You might not know who your community is. And that's again where UNA can help. You're going to want to track legislation. We have an app that's available on our website at a discount called Polity. It's polity.app, and it streamlines and makes effective all those searches that you do for legislation. You might get an update. You might sign up for updates on utah.gov on what's going on with legislation, but that's still really cumbersome. And in the meantime, other laws could happen or other bills could be introduced that you might not know about. We'd encourage you to support any UNA initiatives. Our initiatives are your initiatives. There isn't an organization here that would not benefit from an above the line charitable deduction. I just believe that. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is to encourage your stakeholders to vote. Because if you don't have your community voting for our elected officials, somebody else will. And you can get the attention of legislators by showing a force, meeting in force with them. So if you get a meeting with a legislator, have a letter signed by some of your stakeholders, your board, your clients, about how important that work is. In the 2022 general session, there was a law proposed that would limit vote by mail in Utah. Vote by mail in Utah had over an 80% approval rate by our constituents, and yet a law was proposed to eliminate it. A number of organizations got together, organizations that support voting rights, and they coordinated an impressive campaign. They sent postcards to every legislator's house. They sent postcards to their office. They sent postcards to their work at their office in the Capitol. They texted them, they phoned them, they showed up. They had signs on State Street on the way to the Capitol supporting not supporting the proposed legislation, and they filled the committee rooms. That legislation failed, and we can still vote by mail, but it shows the power of the collective. So yeah, people can ignore some of the people all the time, but they can't ignore us. Remember those numbers? 11,000 nonprofits, 6.7% of our workforce. We have capacity. We just need to figure out how to grow together and work together to take advantage of that. The other thing I'd like to introduce you to is something called Election H. It's, from my recollection, it's the easiest form on the IRS website. And basically it changes how you account for your lobbying activities. We can give you more information about it, but it changes some of the requirements and how you collect that information and makes it administratively easier to lobby for your organization. So as I said, 11,000 nonprofits registered in Utah, 6.7% of the workforce, and $1.5 trillion to the US economy in 1 quarter alone. We're a sleeping giant. So what do we do? I chose this quote: divide and rule, the politician cries, unite and lead is the watchword of the wise. Because I thought it has meaning, and that's a quote from Goethe. And if you've lived in Chicago, that's Goethe Street. Literally, they call it Goethe Street. Always got a kick out of that. So what do? We collaborate on grants. I heard Clint speak to this, and I think that's fabulous. Take it a step forward. Share your resources. And on those collaborations for grants, grantors are interested in their impact. If you can figure out a way to expand your impact and make their investment more efficient, they'll be more interested. We've got a partner on our website, Unite Us, and they can help you refer clients back and forth so that you can then share that information with the grantors. So if you're helping 50 people and another organization is helping 50 people, you can let that grantor know that that's in fact 100 people that are being helped by their services, or maybe it's 75 or whatever that number is, because they care about creating a better world for ourselves. Resources. You might have some a driver diagram ready, and you could share that with someone else. You might have created a trip or a more efficient way to post something on your website or something. You've done something and you've done it well, and you can share that. Find your peers. Find the people who share your mission, who share your dream. And again, we can help with that. Attend nonprofit events. We've got that on the ready. We have a conference coming up in September. We have nonprofit, the Utah Philanthropy Day in November, and we have socials all around the state, because we understand that those ad hoc, one-off, can't believe I had that conversation, can propel you to a new level. Network like you mean it. We do. Attend those executive director coffee and conversations. Find it for development people. And the thing that we've decided that will really help is leaving your egos at the door, because this isn't about you, and it's certainly not about me. Leave your logos at the door. It's not about your organization, and it's certainly not about UNA, but instead it's about the missions, and it's about making our world better. And I want to thank everybody here. The work you do is essential. And if you stop for a moment and thought about how challenging life would be if your organization or the organization, your peer organizations, no longer did the work that they did. When I think about what it would be like if unsheltered humans didn't have a place to go at night, and I know there's not enough, but I just think about how brutal that would be and how many more people we would lose and what an impact that would have on our society. And so I am beyond grateful for the work of the people in this room. So that's my thesis. We're better together. I don't think we can get quite as many people as Dr. Martin Luther King did in his speech on civil rights, but we can do a job. We can connect and work together. And we're here to do that. Stay tuned. If you haven't signed up for UNA's newsletters, you can do that on our website. Thank you all. And I'm turning it back to Clint. Sorry, not Clint, to Gavin.
Well, thank you, Jill. That was great. Appreciate it. I didn't see any questions, Lawrence. Were there any questions that I missed?
No questions that you missed.
Okay, perfect. Well, again, we just want to thank all of you for attending, and thank Clint and Jill again for their not only the information that they just shared with us, but their work that they've done in the communities. Thank all of you for all of the work that you do in your community, in the state of Utah and beyond. We do have a raffle that we'd like to give out. We have a couple of Amazon gift cards. But we noticed that there were some people that came in and left and came in. And so we just want to make sure that we get everybody that's attended. So next week, the middle of next week, we will be reaching out to you if you were one of the lucky winners for an Amazon gift card. So just, maybe you'll win. Hopefully you do. And then after this, I believe, as we're ending it, there is a short survey. We basically just want to know if you thought this was worth your time, if you felt like there was anything we could have done to make it more beneficial, anything like that. So there's just a couple of questions that should take less than a minute or two to fill out. So that was all that we had for you today. I'm glad that we got you all out before 11. Again, if you have any questions for Clint, myself, or Jill, I'm sure you can find our contact information and reach out to us. So thank you so much. And I think we're going to wrap it up and let you get on with the rest of your day. So.
Thanks.